To discuss more about the issue of climate change at the summit, we're joined by Steven Herz. He's joining us from San Francisco. He's a senior attorney in the International Climate Program at the Sierra Club. That's a U.S.-based organization focused on preserving the environment. Steven, thanks so much for joining us. One of the statements that came out of the summit that's likely to grab some headlines is this push for fossil fuels to be phased out by the end of the century with more focus on renewable sources. In fact, German Chancellor Angela Merkel had pushed for an earlier goal of 2050. I wanted to get your take on all of this.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate it. So what we have here is that the leaders of 7 major industrial countries have reiterated the need for really urgent and concrete action to address the crisis of climate change. And the key thing here is that they've said that that action needs to be taken in the context of what the best scientists around the world are telling us is necessary, both in terms of the pace of eliminating emissions and in terms of the scale of the emissions that need to be eliminated. And so they agreed that over the course of the century, all countries working together need to eliminate carbon emissions from their economy. And by mid-century, they need to reduce towards the upper end of the IPCC scale of 40 to 70%. And then on top of that, the actual countries who are part of the G7 also recognize the need for them to totally transform their energy economies. So I think this is really significant in terms of giving long-term direction, both to the climate negotiations that will be taking place at the end of the year, and it really creates momentum for a strong outcome, and also, and equally as important, it gives a strong signal to private sector that the days of dependence on coal and other fossil fuels are waning, and that a clean energy economy is inevitable. And so it's really a shot across the bow for investors who may be considering continued investment in long-lived, carbon-intensive infrastructure investments like coal plants that, with increasing government action and with the rapidly falling prices of renewables, those investments are much riskier than they were before and actually run the risk of being stranded.
And Steven, let me ask you about, the cynics might say, there's a big difference between words and action. We hear a lot of strong words, but in terms of action, ideas, execution, that sort of thing, are you at all skeptical about any of this?
Well, I think what they were working on here are long-term goals, a sort of vision for mid-century and beyond. The individual actions, the actions that countries will take will be reflected in what's called the INDCs, or intended naturally determined contributions, that countries will put forward as part of the Paris Agreement. So that's the place to look for what specific countries are doing to implement their vision of ambitious climate action between now and 2025 or 2030.
Is this enough, given the state of the global warming predicament we're seeing?
It's directionally great. It puts us on a path towards a long-term outcome. And as I said before, it's really critical that they recognized the scientific imperative here and reference the work of the IPCC. But in terms of short-term action, it doesn't address it directly, but we know that countries will be taking ambitious action, but there's a lot more that all countries could be doing to capture the opportunities within their economy, to grow their economy, to invest in clean energy, to clean up their environment, all things that would both have immediate impacts on cleaning their environment and improving their economy, and on reducing emissions.
Let me ask you, because you brought it up the end of the year, this United Nations conference on climate change is going to take place in Paris. We saw President Xi of China and President Obama come into agreement about what they're going to do. We're hearing more out of the G7 summit. What are your expectations going into this conference? Does it seem like the momentum's really going in the right direction?
It does, yeah. And I think it's useful that you reference the U.S.-China agreement because, as you know, China is not a member of the G7 as a developing country. But in a lot of ways, they were here at the table for this agreement because if it weren't for the fact that U.S.-China if it weren't for the fact that we had this agreement between the U.S. and China back in November, it's unlikely that we would have seen this kind of ambition. Because we know that even as leaders look to the horizon for their long-term objectives, they're also stealing glances sideways to see what other countries are doing and making sure that they're not getting too far ahead of other countries in terms of their ambition and their actions. And so the fact that these leaders had confidence that China will act along with them, that was generated by the U.S.-China agreement back in the fall, really paved the way for the long-term ambition that's reflected in this communique.
Steven, thanks so much for joining us from San Francisco and providing your thoughts and observations. Appreciate it.